The sound was the first thing that struck her. Not the auctioneer's patter, a rhythmic drone of numbers and praise for livestock he'd never seen before noon. Not the shuffling of boots in the dry dust of the town square. It was the laughter, low and guttural, from the men leaning against the saloon front, their hats tipped low to ward off the July sun. High and sharp, like breaking glass, from the cluster of women near the mercantile, their faces pinched with a particular kind of piety that passed for virtue in a town like Redemption. Alara stood on the raised platform, the rough-sawn planks hot through the worn soles of her shoes. Her father, Mr. Miller, stood beside her, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He was a man who had mistaken ambition for ability, and now the bill had come due. The property he was auctioning was not a parcel of land or a head of cattle. It was his daughter, or rather her 5-year contract of indentured labor. A legal fiction, a way to sell a person without calling it slavery. A strong back, the auctioneer bellowed, his voice oiled with false enthusiasm. Willing and able, knows her letters and numbers, a fine hand with accounts. And can she cook? Her bread alone is worth the price of admission, gentlemen. More laughter. This time it was directed at the loaves of bread set on a small table beside her, meant to be proof of her domestic skills. The women from the mercantile whispered behind their hands. Alara knew what they were saying. They had said it for years. Her bread was heavy. Her crusts were too dark. Like her. Too heavy. Too solid. Wide-hipped and heavy-footed was the phrase she heard most often. A girl built for work, not for grace. A girl whose value was measured in the labor she could provide, because she had none of the other currency that mattered. She was plain. Look at the size of her. A man's voice drifted from the crowd, loud enough to be heard. She'll eat you out of house and home before she's earned her keep. A fresh wave of amusement rippled through the square. Her father flinched, but said nothing. He had forfeited the right to defend her when he placed her on this block. Alara stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy line of the mesas. She had learned long ago to build a wall inside herself, a place where the words could not reach. But today the wall was cracking. Each laugh was a hammer blow, each whisper a chisel against the stone. A man in a fine waistcoat stepped forward. Mr. Sterling. He owned the bank, the hotel, and half the businesses on Main Street. His smile was thin and predatory. He looked at her not as a person, but as an asset on a ledger sheet. He picked up one of the loaves of bread, weighed it in his manicured hand, and gave a theatrical sniff. A bit coarse, he declared to the crowd, but serviceable. Much like the baker, I imagine. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crawled up her neck and burned her cheeks. For the first time, she turned her head and met his gaze. She did not look away. She let him see the cold fire that had just been lit behind her eyes. The surprise on his face was fleeting but satisfying. He had expected shame. He had expected tears. He had not expected defiance. "We will start the bidding at $20, the auctioneer said, trying to regain control. Silence. $20 for 5 years of a life. The price of a decent horse. $20, Sterling said, his voice smooth as silk, his eyes still locked on Alara's. It was a challenge. The other men in the square knew better than to bid against Mr. Sterling. He did not like competition. "Do I hear 25? The auctioneer pleaded, his gaze sweeping the silent crowd. Alara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. To be owned by any man was a horror. To be owned by that man was a nightmare she could not fathom. His eyes roamed over her, a slow, appraising look that stripped her bare right there in the sun-drenched square. He was not buying a bookkeeper or a cook. He was buying something else entirely. $20 going once, the auctioneer chanted, his voice losing its energy. Going twice. Her father looked away, unable to watch the final transaction of his failure. 30. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a well-honed blade. It came from the back of the crowd, from a man who had been standing in the shadow of the blacksmith's shop. He was tall and broad, dressed in worn denim and scuffed boots. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. Sterling turned, his smile gone. "Who said that?" he demanded. The man stepped forward into the light. Silas Blackwood. A name that carried weight in this valley, though not for its wealth. He owned the Broken Horn Ranch, a spread of hard land that was known for breaking men, not making them. He was a man who kept to himself, known for his stubborn principles and his quiet nature. "I did," Blackwood said. His voice was a low rumble. Sterling's eyes narrowed. "You have no business here, Blackwood. This is a matter for townsfolk." "I'm bidding on a labor contract," Blackwood replied, his gaze not on Sterling, but on Alara. "Last I checked, my money is as good as any other man's." His eyes were different. They were not appraising her body. They were not filled with pity or contempt. They were assessing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending, or a sky that threatens rain. He was calculating. He was seeing a problem and weighing a solution. 35? Sterling snapped, his face flushed with anger. 40, Blackwood said without hesitation. 50. 60. The exchange was sharp and quick. The crowd was no longer laughing. They were watching a different kind of auction now. A battle of wills between two of the valley's most formidable, if opposite, men. Sterling was a man of paper and ink, of debts and foreclosures. Blackwood was a man of dirt and rock, of cattle and barbed wire. $100, Sterling said, his voice tight. A gasp went through the crowd. It was an absurd amount of money. More than 5 years of her labor could ever be worth. This was no longer about a contract. It was about pride. It was about power. Blackwood was silent for a long moment. He pushed his hat back slightly, revealing a weathered face and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He looked at Sterling, then back at Alara. His gaze held hers, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something flicker there. Not pity. Recognition. 101, he said, his voice flat and final. The single dollar was the real insult. It was a gesture of contempt, a declaration that he would win this by any margin, however small, and that Sterling's money held no power over him. Sterling's face went pale, then a dark, mottled red. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. He had been beaten and beaten publicly. He spun on his heel and stalked away without another word. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, banging his gavel with a loud crack. "To Mr. Blackwood for $101. The tension in the square broke. People began to talk, to move, to drift away. The show was over. Her father stepped forward, holding out a hand to Blackwood. A sycophantic smile plastered on his face. Blackwood ignored him. He walked directly to the platform, his heavy boots making the planks thud. He stopped in front of Alara. He did not offer a hand to help her down. He simply waited. She gathered the thin fabric of her skirt and stepped down from the block, landing on the dusty ground. She had been bought and sold. The transaction was complete. But as she stood there, in the shadow of the man who now owned her next 5 years, she felt a sliver of something that was not despair. She had been saved from Sterling. But she had been delivered into the hands of a stranger. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that one cage was just as binding as another. She followed him as he paid the auctioneer and her father, the crisp bills changing hands without a word. Then he turned and walked away. She followed. She did not know where she was going. She only knew that she was leaving the only life she had ever known. As they passed the mercantile, she saw the women watching her. Their faces were no longer mocking. They were curious, confused. She had become a story they did not understand. The fat girl, the plain girl, had just been fought over by 2 men. It made no sense in their world. They reached the edge of town, where a simple buckboard wagon was tied. Blackwood gestured for her to get in. Before she could, he stopped her. He reached over and picked up one of the loaves of her bread from the auction table, which had been left behind. He looked at it, then at her. He tucked it into a sack without a word and climbed onto the wagon seat. The gesture was unreadable. Was it a reminder of her failure? A symbol of what he had purchased? She did not know. She climbed up beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the town of Redemption behind in a cloud of yellow dust. And in the silence that stretched between them, Alara found the place behind the wall inside her. It was a small, dark room. She closed the door. And she made a vow. She would serve her time. She would work until her hands bled and her back ached. She would be a model of servitude. But she would never trust him. She would never depend on any man again. She would survive this. And then she would be free. Alone. But free. It was the only promise she had left to give, and she gave it to herself. Chug. They rode in silence for the better part of an hour. The sun beat down, and the air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and hot dust. Alara kept her eyes on the horizon, watching the landscape shift from the flat valley floor to the rolling foothills of the mountains. The silence was a weight. It was heavier than any conversation could have been. She was acutely aware of the man beside her. The breadth of his shoulders, the way his large, calloused hands held the reins with an easy confidence. He did not look at her. He just drove, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. Finally, he spoke. The contract is a lie. His voice startled her. It was deeper than she had expected, with a rough edge to it, like stones grinding together. She turned to look at him, her face a mask of careful neutrality. I don't understand, she said. I needed a bookkeeper, he said, still not looking at her. My foreman, Jed, he can read a brand and a sky, but numbers give him a headache. Your father mentioned you were good with ledgers. He was giving her a reason. A practical, logical reason for what had happened. She did not believe him. A bookkeeper is hired, she said, her voice sharp. Not bought. He finally turned his head and met her gaze. His eyes were clear and direct. There was no artifice in them. Sterling wasn't buying a bookkeeper, he said quietly. We both know that. I bought the contract to keep you away from him. The statement was so blunt, so devoid of flattery or guile, that it took her breath away. Why? She asked, the single word a challenge. He looked back at the trail. Because I don't like bullies, he said. And I don't like seeing things treated like they don't have value. Things. The word stung, but the way he said it was different. He wasn't calling her an object. He was talking about a principle. So what are the terms? She asked, her voice hard. Since the contract is a lie. The terms are simple, he said. There's a room for you off the main house. It has its own door. It has a lock. The key will be yours. You will work the ranch accounts. You will help in the kitchen. For this, you will be paid a fair wage. $10 a month, plus your board. She stared at him, suspicion warring with a disorienting flicker of something else. Hope. She crushed it immediately. Hope was a fool's game. And the contract? She pressed. The 5 years. The contract gives me the right to your labor, he said. It doesn't give me the right to your life. You are free to leave whenever you wish. All you have to do is walk down that road and don't look back. I won't stop you. He paused, the wagon wheels crunching over a patch of loose gravel. But if you stay, he continued, you will be treated with respect. By me and by my men. You will be judged on the work you do, not on the gossip in town. It was too much. It was too good to be true. Men did not operate this way. Men who spent $101 on a woman did not give her a key and the freedom to leave. Why should I believe you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, the silence stretching out again. She thought he was going to ignore the question. "You shouldn't," he said at last. "Belief is something you earn. I haven't earned it yet." He pulled the wagon to a stop under the shade of a lone, twisted cottonwood tree. "We'll rest the horses," he said, climbing down. He went to the back of the wagon and returned with the sack that held her bread. He also had a canteen and a small, wrapped parcel. He handed her the canteen. "Water," he said. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough as bark, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He then opened the parcel. It was a block of cheese and a small knife. He sliced a piece of her bread, laid a slice of cheese on it, and held it out to her. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question was so simple, so direct. But no one had asked her that all day. No one had thought to. In the midst of her humiliation, her fear, her sail from one life to another, the basic fact of her own body's needs had been completely ignored. She was hungry. She was starving. She looked at the bread in his hand. Her heavy, dark, imperfect bread. She reached out and took it. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He gave a short, sharp nod. Then he did something that shattered the last of her composure. He turned his back on her. He walked over to the horses, busying himself with checking their harnesses, giving her the privacy to eat without being watched, without being judged. She sat on the wagon seat, the bread and cheese in her hand, and a single hot tear escaped her eye and rolled down her dusty cheek. It was an act of kindness so profound in its simplicity that it breached the wall she had so carefully constructed. A man had bought her, and then he had fed her, and he had given her the dignity of eating alone. She took a bite. The bread was dense. The crust was thick. But it was honest bread. It was filling. And at that moment, it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite. When she was finished, she took a long drink of water from the canteen. Blackwood was still with the horses. He seemed to be in no hurry. She watched him, this quiet, inscrutable man. He moved with an economy of motion, his actions purposeful and unhurried. He was a part of this landscape, as weathered and resilient as the rocks and the sagebrush. He was not a man of the town. He was something else. Her vow from that afternoon echoed in her mind. Never trust. Never depend. The vow still held. But for the first time, a question attached itself to it. What if he was different? It was a dangerous question. A treacherous one. She pushed it away. He was a man. And men, in her experience, were all the same in the end. They wanted something. She just hadn't figured out what Silas Blackwood wanted yet. But she would. She would watch. She would wait. And she would be ready. He finished with the horses and turned back to the wagon. He saw that she was done eating. He took another slice of her bread, put a piece of cheese on it, and ate it in 3 large bites, standing right there in the sun. "Good bread," he said, his mouth full. He wiped his hands on his trousers, climbed back onto the wagon seat, and picked up the reins. "Let's go," he said. "It's a ways yet." And as they rode on, Elara held onto her suspicion like a shield. But she could not forget the taste of the bread, or the kindness of a man who had turned his back to let her eat in peace. Ja. The Broken Horn Ranch was aptly named. It sat in a wide basin, cupped by a ring of jagged, broken-toothed hills. The land itself looked hard, unforgiving. The buildings were no different. They were functional, weathered to a silver gray by sun and wind, but they sagged with a kind of weary neglect. A fence post was leaning. A shutter hung from a single hinge. The whole place felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the final blow. It was a reflection of its owner, struggling, but not yet broken. As they pulled into the yard, a man emerged from the largest barn. He was older, wiry, and tough as boiled leather, with a limp that favored his left leg. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, and his pale eyes missed nothing. This had to be Jed, the foreman. He stopped and watched them approach, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered to Alara, took her in from head to toe in a single, comprehensive sweep, and then dismissed her. He looked at Blackwood. "Trouble in town?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "The usual," Blackwood said, swinging down from the wagon. "Jed, this is Alara Miller. She'll be handling the books and helping in the kitchen." Jed grunted. It was not a welcome. It was a skeptical acknowledgement of her presence. "The books are a mess," he said, as if it were her fault. "I know," Blackwood said. "That's why she's here." He turned to Alara. "The house is there. Your room is the one at the back on the ground floor. Door's unlocked. I'll bring your things." Her things consisted of a single, small carpet bag. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the long ride. The yard was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grass. She could feel Jed's eyes on her back as she walked toward the house. She was being weighed and measured, and she knew she was being found wanting. The house was large but simple, a two-story clapboard structure that had once been painted white. The inside was worse than the outside. It was a man's house, not just messy, but deeply, fundamentally disorganized. Dishes were piled in the sink. A layer of dust coated every surface. The air was stale, smelling of old coffee and fried bacon. It was a space that had been without a woman's touch for a long time. This was not a judgment. It was an observation, an assessment of a system that was failing. And Alara understood systems. She found her room. It was small and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a small table, and a wooden chair. But it was clean, and as promised, it had its own door to the outside. And in the lock there was a key. Blackwood appeared a few moments later, placing her bag on the floor. "It's not much," he said. "It's enough," she replied. He hesitated in the doorway, seeming unsure of what to say next. "The kitchen is disorganized," he said, a masterpiece of understatement. "I saw," she said. "Supper is usually around 7, he added. "The men will be hungry." He was not ordering her. He was stating a fact. He was leaving the solution up to her. It was a test. "I'll manage," she said. He nodded, then left, closing the door behind him. She was alone. She stood in the center of the small room and took a deep breath. This was her new life. A dusty ranch, a silent boss, a hostile foreman, and a kitchen that looked like a battle had been fought in it. It was bleak, but it was better than being with Sterling. And she had a room with a lock. That was more than she had ever had before. She did not unpack her bag. Instead, she walked into the kitchen and surveyed the chaos. She rolled up her sleeves, and she began to work. Work was something she understood. Work was honest. It did not lie or flatter or deceive. The results were plain to see. She started with the water pump at the sink, priming it until clean water flowed. She heated water on the massive wood-burning stove. She scrubbed the dishes, scoured the pots, and wiped down every surface until the wood grain of the countertops was visible again. She found the pantry. It was a disaster of half-empty sacks of flour, open tins, and a general state of entropy. But there was food. Potatoes, onions, salt pork, beans, flour, coffee. The basics. She could work with the basics. She began to impose order. She swept the floor. She cleaned the stove. She organized the pantry, taking inventory in her head. This was her language. The quiet, methodical creation of order from chaos. By the time the sun began to set, the kitchen was transformed. It was clean. It was organized. And the air was filled with the smell of roasting potatoes and onions, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee. A pot of beans simmered on the back of the stove. She had found a side of salt pork and fried it until it was crisp. It was simple food. Ranch food. But it was hot and plentiful. At 7 o'clock, she heard the sound of boots on the porch. The door opened and 3 men walked in. Blackwood, Jed, and a younger hand, barely a boy with a shock of red hair. They stopped just inside the door, their expressions identical.
Shock?
They looked around the clean, orderly kitchen as if they had never seen it before. They looked at the stove laden with food. Their eyes were wide. Alara stood by the counter, her hands wrapped in an apron she had found and washed. She said nothing. She just waited. Jed was the first to recover. He walked over to the coffee pot, poured himself a mug, and took a sip. He looked at the mug, then at her. "Ha!" he grunted. It was the highest form of praise she could have imagined from him. The young hand stared at the platter of fried pork with undisguised reverence. Blackwood's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. The clean counters, the organized shelves, the gleaming sink. He looked at her, and his expression was the same as it had been on the trail. Assessing. But there was something else in it now. Respect. "Supper's ready," she said quietly. The men moved to the table like a pack of starving wolves. They ate in silence, a focused, serious kind of eating that spoke of long hours of hard labor. Alara did not join them. She served them, refilling the coffee pot, bringing more food from the stove. When they were finished, their plates clean, they pushed their chairs back. The young hand looked at her. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, blushing slightly. "That was the best meal I've had in a year." Jed just grunted again and limped out of the room. Blackwood remained at the table. He looked at the empty platter, then at her. "Supper was good," he said. Coming from him, it felt like a lengthy speech, a significant emotional breakthrough. "Tomorrow," he said, rising from the table, "we can start on the books." He left the room. She was alone again in the warm, clean kitchen. She had survived her first day. She had met the first test and passed. She had fed them. She had brought a small measure of order to their chaotic world. She began to clear the table, her movements efficient and sure. She still did not trust him. She still did not trust any of them. But she had found a foothold. In this place of neglect and decay, her competence had value. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough.
Vuge.
The days settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Alara worked in the kitchen, preparing a massive breakfast for the hands before they rode out. After that, the kitchen was hers. She baked bread, her heavy, dense bread, which the men ate without complaint, grateful for anything that filled their bellies. She cleaned and organized, extending her sphere of influence from the kitchen to the rest of the main house. Slowly, methodically, she was pushing back the tide of masculine neglect. In the afternoons, she sat at the small, cluttered desk in Blackwood's office, a room that smelled of leather, tobacco, and old paper, and she wrestled with the books. Jed had been right. They were a mess. A chaotic tangle of receipts, invoices, and scrawled notations. It was a puzzle, and Alara's mind, which saw the world in systems and patterns, slowly began to piece it together. She created new ledgers, her handwriting neat and precise. She tracked expenses and income, building a true picture of the ranch's financial health. The picture was grim. The broken horn was bleeding money. Silas Blackwood was teetering on the edge of ruin. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, the rhythm was broken. A sharp, metallic screech echoed from the direction of the main well, followed by a string of curses from Jed. Alara looked out the office window. Blackwood and Jed were standing by the windmill, which powered the pump for the well. The blades of the windmill were still, even though a steady breeze was blowing. The ranch had other water sources, a creek and a few smaller wells, but this was the main one, the one that fed the troughs for the bulk of the herd. Without it, they were in trouble. She watched as the 2 men, joined by the young, red-haired hand named Cale, struggled with the pump mechanism. They were strong men. They applied brute force, trying to muscle the frozen gears into moving. The screeching sound came again, worse this time. Alara put down her pen. She had grown up around her father's failed businesses. A grist mill. A freight company. She knew machines. She understood the logic of gears and levers, of stress and tolerance. She walked out into the yard, her boots sinking into the soft dust. The men were so focused on their task that they didn't notice her approach. "It's seized up solid," Jed growled, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a greasy glove. "The main gear's probably cracked," Blackwood said, his voice tight with frustration. "We'll have to pull the whole assembly apart. That would take days. Days they didn't have." Alara stood a few feet away, watching. She wasn't looking at the main gear. She was looking at the smaller transfer pinion, half hidden beneath the main housing. She saw it. Tiny, dark line. A hairline fracture, almost invisible. But it wasn't the crack that was the problem. It was the alignment. The fracture had caused the pinion to shift, just a fraction of an inch. It was no longer meshing properly with the drive shaft. It was binding. Forcing it would only shatter the gear completely. She hesitated. To speak up was to invite ridicule. To insert herself into a man's world, a world of mechanics and steel. But to stay silent was to watch them destroy their own well. She took a breath. "It's not the main gear," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through their grunts of effort. The three men stopped and turned to look at her. Their faces were a mixture of surprise and annoyance. Jed's expression was openly dismissive. "This ain't a kitchen stove, missy," he said, his tone condescending. "I know," she said, her gaze steady. "The stove is cast iron. This is milled steel. But the principle is the same." She stepped forward, pointing. "Look there. The transfer pinion. It slipped its seating. You can see the scoring on the housing where it's grinding. If you keep forcing it, you'll shear the teeth off the drive shaft." Blackwood and Cale leaned in, following her finger. Jed stayed where he was, his arms crossed, a skeptical scowl on his face. Blackwood squinted, his eyes tracing the lines of the machinery. He saw it. A slow flicker of understanding dawned on his face. "She's right," he said, his voice quiet with surprise. "Look, Jed. The alignment's off." Jed limped over, grumbling under his breath. He peered at the pinion, then at the drive shaft. He was silent for a long time. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head. "How do we fix it?" Blackwood asked, his question directed not at Jed, but at Alara. It was a profound shift, a transference of authority. She was no longer the cook. She was the expert. "You can't force it back," she said, her confidence growing. "You have to relieve the pressure first. Disconnect the drive rod from the sucker pump. That will give you enough play in the shaft to reseat the pinion. You'll need a heavy mallet and a block of wood to tap it back into place without damaging the teeth." She laid out the steps with a calm, clear logic. Blackwood listened intently, nodding. Jed just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "Cale, get the tools," Blackwood ordered. The young man, who had been watching Alara with a look of awe, scrambled off to the workshop. For the next hour, Alara directed the repair. She did not touch the tools herself. She stood back and gave instructions, her voice calm and steady. "Easy with that wrench. No, tap it from the other side. You need to drive it straight. Watch the seating. A little more. Stop." The men followed her directions without question. She understood the machine in a way they did not. Finally, it was done. The pinion was reseated. The drive rod was reconnected. "All right," she said. "Engage the brake and try turning the blades by hand." Slowly, Blackwood grabbed one of the massive windmill blades and pushed. There was a soft click, and then the gears meshed smoothly, silently. The drive shaft turned. The sucker rod began its slow, rhythmic rise and fall. A moment later, a stream of clear, cold water gushed from the pipe into the trough. A collective sigh of relief went through the men. Cale whooped with delight. Jed stared at the water, then at Alara, and for the second time, he shook his head in disbelief. He didn't say a word. He just turned and limped back to the barn. Blackwood stood by the pump, his hand resting on the now cool metal of the housing. He looked at the flowing water, then he turned his gaze to Alara. The look in his eyes was one of genuine, undisguised astonishment. He had bought a bookkeeper. He had discovered a mechanic. He walked over to her, stopping a few feet away. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. "My father was a miller," she said, offering an explanation before he could ask. "He was always buying machines he couldn't afford and didn't know how to fix. I learned." "You learned well," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. He was looking at her differently now. He was seeing past the plain face and the heavy-set figure. He was seeing the mind behind her eyes. He was seeing her true worth. He took a step closer. "What else can you do?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them, vast and full of possibility. It was not a question about cooking or cleaning or mending. It was a question about everything. And Alara, for the first time in her life, felt a stirring of something she had long since buried.
Breathe.
She had been seen. Not for her appearance, not for her gender, but for her competence. "I can read a ledger," she said, her voice steady. "And I can tell you exactly why this ranch is failing." The challenge was issued. The alliance was about to be forged. In the quiet of the dusty ranch yard, everything had just changed.
Cha.
That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, she led him into the office. The room was small, lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast flickering shadows on the walls. She had spent the afternoon consolidating her findings. The new ledgers she had created were stacked neatly on the desk. They told a story of a slow, deliberate financial strangulation. "The problem isn't your land or your cattle," she began, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The problem is your cash flow, and it's being siphoned off." She opened the top ledger. "Let's start with supplies. You buy your grain, salt licks, and wire from the town mercantile. For the past 2 years, the prices you've paid have been consistently 20% higher than market rate." She pointed to a column of figures. "I compared your receipts with the prices listed in the Territorial Gazette. You're being overcharged, systematically." Blackwood leaned over the desk, his expression grim. "Jed handles the supply runs," he said, his voice a low growl. "Jed is loyal," Alara countered immediately. "But he's not a man who questions a receipt. He pays what he's told to pay. The mercantile is owned by a holding company. I looked it up in the county records." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "The holding company is owned by Mr. Sterling." Blackwood's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He said nothing, but his eyes were hard as granite. "Next," she said, moving to the second ledger. "Cattle sales." She showed him the records. For the past 18 months, a significant portion of his herd had been sold to a single buyer, a man named Henderson, for prices well below what they should have fetched. Every time you've been in a tight spot, needing quick cash to cover a note, this Henderson has shown up with an offer. It seemed like a lifeline, but it was a leak, draining the value right out of your herd. "Henderson is Sterling's cousin," Blackwood said, his voice flat. "I suspected as much," Alara said. "And the notes you were paying off? The ones that put you in a tight spot in the first place." She tapped the third ledger. "Every one of them was held by Sterling's bank. He creates the debt, then he sends his cousin to buy your assets at a discount to pay for it. It's a closed loop, designed to bleed you dry, slowly, so you don't see it happening until it's too late." The full scope of the conspiracy hung in the air of the small office. It was elegant in its cruelty. A death by 1,000 cuts. Blackwood stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. I trusted him, he said, his voice rough with betrayal. My father did business with his father. I thought he was a friend. He is not your friend, Elara said softly. He wants your land. More specifically, he wants your water. She unrolled a map of the valley, weighting the corners with books. Your ranch has the most reliable water rights in this entire basin. The creek runs year-round. The wells never go dry. The railroad is planning a new spur line through this valley. A line that will need a lot of water for its steam engines. She traced a line on the map with her finger. If Sterling controls your water, he controls where the railroad builds its depot. And whoever controls the depot controls the future of this entire valley. It was all there. The motive, the method, the man. Blackwood was silent for a long time, the lamplight carving deep lines into his face. He was a man cornered, a man who had just realized the wolves were not at the door, but had been inside his house all along. I'll ride into town tomorrow, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'll have a talk with Mr. Sterling. No, Elara said, her voice sharp. He turned from the window, his eyes blazing. He has cheated me. He has tried to ruin me. A man does not let that stand. A physical confrontation is what he wants, she argued, standing to face him. He is a man of paper and law. You are a man of fists and pride. In a fight you might win, but in a courtroom he will destroy you. He will paint you as a violent, unstable man who can't manage his own affairs. He will use it as justification to foreclose. So we do nothing? He demanded, his frustration boiling over. We let him win. No, she said, her voice firm. We do not let him win. We beat him at his own game. Her eyes shone in the lamplight, her expression fierce and intelligent. We fight with this, she said, tapping the ledgers. With proof, with facts. We don't let him know that we know. We gather more evidence. We find his weak spot. And then, when the time is right, we expose him for the cheat and the liar that he is. She looked him directly in the eye, her resolve unbending. We need a strategy, Silas. Not a brawl. She had used his first name. She hadn't even realized it. The sound of it, spoken in her voice, seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. It was no longer an employee advising her boss. It was a partner, an ally. He stared at her, the anger in his eyes slowly being replaced by something else. A grudging admiration. A realization that the woman standing before him was more formidable than any man he knew. We? He asked, his voice softer now. Yes, she said, her chin held high. We. He tried to humiliate me. He is trying to destroy you. This is my fight now, too. Her vow of self-reliance, of never depending on anyone, felt 1,000 miles away. This was not dependence. This was an alliance. A choice. A slow nod from Blackwood. All right, Elara, he said, the name a promise. We do it your way. A knock on the office door made them both jump. Jed stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands. Beg pardon, boss, he said, his eyes flicking from Blackwood to Elara and back again. Rider coming up the road. Looks like Sterling's buggy. Elara and Blackwood exchanged a look. The wolf was coming to the door. He must have heard about the pump, Blackwood murmured. Heard that we fixed it. He's coming to see what's changed, Elara said quickly, her mind racing. He's coming to assess his new variable. Me. She began to stack the ledgers, pushing them to the side of the desk. Let him come, she said, her voice low and steady. Let him think we are nothing but a failing rancher and his fat new housekeeper. Let him underestimate us. It's the most powerful weapon we have. Blackwood gave a curt nod. They walked out onto the porch just as a fine, polished buggy pulled into the yard, drawn by a pair of perfectly matched black horses. Mr. Sterling stepped down, elegant and composed in a dark suit. He smiled, a practiced, charming expression that didn't reach his cold eyes. Silas, he said, his voice booming with false friendship. I was in the area and thought I'd stop by. See how you're faring. His gaze slid past Blackwood and settled on Alara. His smile widened, becoming a smirk. And I see you're putting your new acquisition to good use, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I must say, Silas, that was the best $100 you ever spent. She has certainly filled out the place. The insult was designed to do two things: to remind Alara of her shame, of the auction block, and to remind Silas of her origins, to frame her as a piece of property, not a person whose counsel he should trust. Alara felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The old humiliation, the familiar sting of being judged for her size. But then she met Silas's eyes, and she saw the cold, controlled fury there. And she remembered the ledgers in the office. She remembered the plan. She took a small step forward, forcing Sterling to look at her directly. She did not cower. She did not look away. She gave him a small, polite smile. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice even and calm. Would you care for a cup of coffee? It's fresh. The simple, domestic offer completely disarmed him. He had expected tears or anger. He had not expected civility. He had expected a victim. He was looking at a strategist. And he was too arrogant to see the difference. No, thank you, he stammered, momentarily thrown off his game. Another time, perhaps, she said, her smile never wavering. She had just won the first skirmish, and Sterling didn't even know the war had begun. He turned his attention back to Silas, launching into a series of overly solicitous questions about the ranch. His words a smokescreen for his true purpose, to gauge the extent of the damage, to see how close his prey was to collapse. Silas played his part perfectly, answering in monosyllables, his demeanor that of a worried, beaten man. Alara stood silently beside him, a portrait of domestic servitude. But beneath the surface, a silent conversation was taking place between them. A shared understanding, a common purpose. They were a team, and Mr. Sterling, in all his cleverness, had just made the fatal mistake of his life. He had underestimated them both.